I'd like to welcome Jim Middleton, Ramona Koval and Ross Gittins. Please join me in welcoming them. We're going to today be talking about wisdom and reinvention, about the things that journalists learn through long careers and the ways that experienced journalists have to remake themselves to remain relevant and active in new journalism environments. So I thought what I'd ask each of you to do very briefly is just tell us what you do and where you've come from. Can you do that in about a minute each? Sum up your careers. Is that possible?
A minute.
A minute.
See, this is the problem with the new journalism. You have a minute. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, just tell us
what I do now.
What you do now and where you've come from.
I write books now, and I sometimes do a bit of journalism on the side. And where do I come from? My first, I was a science graduate, did some science. Husband left, looked after, had 2 kids to look after. Started to write for The Age in science journalism because it kept the wolf from the door. Well, I taught at RMIT and a bit at Melbourne University in genetics, microbiology, science, technology and society. And then journalism got into my blood and it was so much fun and it was so exciting. And I started to do little things as a freelancer for Radio National in the science unit, film reviews, book reviews. I got my first job at the ABC properly full-time about 1988 and then was there for about 24 years.
I think the problem with this approach is that you're going to be really modest. Because Ramona, you've had a distinguished career as a broadcaster at the ABC, at Radio National and at 3LO, which became 774. Ramona at the moment is an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne, and she's the author of a book called Bloodhound, Searching for My Father, a long-form piece of journalism, really, isn't it?
It's a long-form bit of literary non-fiction.
Yeah. Ross, who are you? Where are you from?
Well, I started life as a chartered accountant. I got a bit bored with chartered accounting and stumbled around for a year and ended up at the Sydney Morning Herald, where they made me a cadet journalist, and I've been there ever since.
So the immodest bit?
The immodest bit, well, for 40 years I've been pretending to know a lot about economics and writing about it and explaining it to people.
That's not immodest. That's very modest. You're the economics editor at the Sydney Morning Herald. That's your day job. And Jim?
I started work as a journalist when John Gorton was Prime Minister, Henry Bolte was Premier of Victoria, and Bob Askin was Premier of New South Wales. Fine fellows, all of them, and I've basically been involved in political journalism ever since, including 20 years in Canberra through the Hawke Keating and Howard years and into the election of Kevin Rudd. Subsequently spent 7 or 8 years with the ABC's Overseas Service, the Australian Network, until that folded, and I'm now a correspondent working for Sky News.
And a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne.
And that too.
Attached to the
Yes,
Centre
they obviously know nothing about my academic record.
And you're attached to the Centre for Advancing Journalism. Let's talk about this idea of experience. Does it matter? Is it important to have experience as a journalist? Can you get by without it?
I would say, just very briefly, and without having tickets on myself, I would say that these days I feel like I know everything and I know nothing, in the sense that my experience obviously makes journalism easier, and the corporate memory that comes with it is very valuable indeed. But in this disruptive and changing time, my ability to manage and indeed understand what's happening with new media is primitive to rudimentary at best, and my ability to use them and see how they can be best used to advantage is something, quite frankly, that I struggle with.
Ross, you touched on this in your keynote. You talked about the fact that there have been plenty of other times before in history where there's been disruption to journalism, but you posed the question that maybe this generation more than any other has experienced disruption on a greater degree?
Well, I mean, it's always tempting to think that the current episode is the biggest ever, but I am pushed to think of other challenges to journalism that have been more discombobulating than the digital disruption. On the question of experience, I think experience is very valuable. Do you have to have it? No. And if I was an editor, I'd like to have a reasonable number of very experienced people, and I'd like to have a lot of young people, inexperienced people too, because I think that youth has its own set of advantages. Young people are often far more vigorous than old farts, and ambitious, and inquisitive, energetic. And that's worth a lot. It's worth a lot in journalism. It's still worth a lot. And it's worth a lot to have news stories written by people who are so young that they're convinced nothing has ever happened like this before. In fact, I used to think that if I was an editor, what I'd like is young people to write the front page and get terribly excited about whatever it was the Prime Minister had just done. And then I'd have a couple of old guys, Alan Ramsey and Ross Gittins, up the back saying, I've seen it all before and it doesn't amount to a row of beans. Which you've seen Alan Ramsey write that column many times. And I think if I was an editor, that way I'd have an each way bet. And whenever somebody complained that you got far too excited on the front page and made it sound much more important than it really was, you'd point to the old farts up the back.
Well,
Ramona?
I think experience counts enormously, and we've done different kinds of journalism, all of us, and my kind of journalism has been more sort of, interviewing and being behind people and their work and in sort of the literary stuff, but before that science, and before that sort of daily radio on 3LO 774. Experience is important because you learn to be you learn not to be self-conscious, and once you have dropped the sense of self-consciousness, you realise that the other person, the talent, is the interesting thing. And your job is to make them shine, or to shine a light on them, or to get into the nooks and crannies that maybe they don't want you to get into, or, it's focused on them and not you. And I think, and I learnt that the only way to get rid of self-consciousness is to be utterly prepared, over-prepared, know everything about them or about the story that you're doing that you could possibly know, and then be surprised, and then if you are surprised, follow the other lead. Well, you've got a very good sort of a safety net underneath you, and once you have that and you lose that sense of I'm here and I'm interviewing this person and my God, they're so important and I'm so not, and how will I understand it, and what happens if they don't like me, or what happens if they are rude to me? I mean, all of the things that you do when you're younger. If you can get rid of that, I think it's easier to do the job and you do a better job. But that's not to say that you need to be older to have that experience, because, if you've worked in a shop, or you've done other kinds of jobs, or, I'm a great believer in doing journalism after you've done a sort of main first degree, or you've got a kind of body of knowledge, whether you've done other sorts of work or you've done other sorts of degrees, because that gives you experience in another area, in another body of knowledge, and you can bring that, even if you're 23, to whatever you need to do. And I agree that, you've got to be curious and enthusiastic and energetic, and I still think I am.
And so you're saying that young people don't have a monopoly on that?
No, that's right. Young people don't have a monopoly on that. Curiosity is the thing that you have to keep.
I thought your point was interesting, that you tend to over-prepare, and that's a mark of your experience as a way
and anxiety.
Yep. But I think also an interesting thing about that is that inexperienced people who over-prepare, they go into those interviews wanting to show off all of that preparation.
You just never do that.
So over time, that's one of the many things
you drop
learn.
that,
It falls
because
away.
you don't actually have to...
Sublimation of ego is not a bad thing. I mean, this is not a business that attracts shrinking violets, but the ability to recognise that it's the audience that is the reader that are the important people, rather than you're just a transmission belt in effect to get ideas and facts through to an audience, rather than it being about you or about me.
Jim, can you chart that process where you sublimated the ego? And
well, I think for me, I think it actually came with confidence. That is, that started off and probably remain not a particularly confident individual. Which is odd, given I'm in the most exposed form of journalism there is. But I think that the recognition that it was not about me came with the increasing confidence that developed with experience. That is, simply by doing it, the more you talk to people, the more you sought to find out stuff that people didn't want to tell you, the more you realised that the value of what you were achieving was not what you brought to the story or what you brought to the information that you were presenting, but simply the ability to present the information in an interesting and entertaining light, of which I think Ross, in an area which is conventionally seen as being as dry as dust, is a great exemplar. I was just going to pick up on one thing that Ross talked about the enthusiasm and excitement of youth and the crusty old devils like himself and my old mate Alan Ramsey, which is one of the disturbing things I think about modern media institutions, and this goes certainly for the ABC and also at Sky, which is, I have to say, a mature institution as well. It doesn't seem to be all that old, but it is challenged by the digital disruption as well, which is that there are an awful lot of enthusiastic young people and a few crusty old buggers like myself, but the middle ranks of journalism have been terribly hollowed out.
Yes.
And this has had a significant impact on career paths, because it means that someone who's been in the business for 2 or 3 years and is just getting to that point where they can be left alone to a degree to develop their skills, abilities, then get lost to the trade. They end up being encouraged simply by the fact that there's a lack of opportunity internally to work on as journalists, to go into PR, or that horrible word comms that is now being developed, and whether it be in politics or in corporate relations, and then they're lost to you forever. And there are a lot of very good minds and a lot of experience that is being lost that way, I think.
Can I ask Ross about that? Because Ross, at the Sydney Morning Herald, you must have, over the last 3 years, witnessed the purge of people leaving the newsroom. You know, there have been legions of people that have left Fairfax in reasonably senior positions.
That's certainly true. Certainly true. In the old days, when we had a redundancy round, it was all about basically bribing people to retire. And the thing about that is that after a while you realise that if you're getting old and tired and you'd love to retire, you've got to keep sitting there till somebody hands you this bag of money and asks you to go away.
Did anyone tap you on the shoulder?
No. They made it pretty clear that my application would not be considered favourably. But more recently, as we got rid of all those old guys, and some women, but not all that many, we started really getting rid of the middle level. Now, that's paid some price. We've lost a lot of experience there, and those people have all been kind of bribed to go away and get a job as a PR for some minister. But if you put enough effort into training new recruits, and if you pick them well enough, it's actually quite an attractive position for them, because they, for the first time, other than those people who've been sitting underneath the baby boomers for their entire career, you can say to them, and in fact this is what happened, when my boss got more applications for the redundancy than he needed, he went round all the young people saying, don't ask for redundancy, you won't get much money because you haven't been here long, and as soon as all these other people go, we'll be able to really move you along. And so if you've got good people, you develop a vacuum for them to expand into. So for really young, capable journalists now, I mean, there are doubts about the future and so on, but right now there is room to give you a promotion if you can
But the cost is
handle it.
that the organisation loses a lot of experience and it's part of its corporate memory.
Lobotomy, I think, is the word.
Oh,
I'm
that's
looking
true. You do lose corporate memory, and that is a cost.
And this has been happening at the ABC, as both of you have witnessed, you know, either inside or from afar.
I would like to say that the first interview that I ever did for the ABC as a freelancer was an interview for Science Bookshop. It was a program that was run by Kirsten Garrett. She was Kirsten Blash, I think, then. And I had mucked around at 3RRR and had a little science show, and I was teaching at RMIT, and this was my opportunity to do an interview. So I did this interview with this Monash anthropologist, and he'd written a book, and I sent it in on a reel-to-reel tape, and Kirsten sent me back a 4-page letter, typed, very closely typed, about why she wasn't going to use it. And she started from the beginning about how I'd introduced him, and then she said, and you asked this first question, which was a good question, and then he said this, and then you asked the second question, but you didn't follow up what he'd said. And the third question, and of course, because I'd done what every rookie person does, it was like and because I was so self-conscious, these are fantastic questions.
Yes.
And I am going to ask all of these great questions. Who cares what he says? I mean, it's about the questions. And
That's about confidence, though, isn't it?
well, it's about confidence. It's also, it's about not understanding what it is.
Listening.
But it's her. She wrote me 4 pages.
Yes.
Can you imagine 4 pages to sit down to this girl who's just and I got it, and I thought I was completely mortified, of course. And then I rang the guy up again, and I went back and interviewed him, and I lied, and I said, oh, they lost the tape at the ABC or something like that. And I did it again, and I sent it in again, and it got on. And what I'm saying is experience and mentorship is really important.
And what she was doing there was the equivalent of what all those sub-editors did in the newspapers that have now gone. They've all left the newsroom.
She saw that I could do some things and I couldn't do other things, but I had some kind of talent for something, and she had time. And I was a freelance. I mean, you know, can you imagine now they don't even have time to talk to the people who are there full time and they're working for them. But that was the kind of thing. And when I got there, and then somebody else taught me how to make a documentary for the women's unit, and that was the first radio documentary I'd made. And you know, you were working as a freelance then, and you were somewhere in England sending bits and pieces of tape in. And one of the other first things, my job was to put it together and make a program out of your stuff that you sent from Manchester or something.
Yeah, and it was from Newcastle, and I remember receiving the program that went to air, and that was how, even though I'd done a 3-year university degree, I think that was the formative experience for me that taught me how to make a radio documentary, which is what I went on to do for the next 15, 20 years.
That's right. So we were all there sharing our knowledge, sharing our information, you know, being ingenues, being unsure, and people had time to help us.
I'm involved in a project where we're charting the course of a lot of the people who've left industrial newsrooms. You know, it's called the New Beats Project. It's funded by the ARC. And the thing that we're finding again and again with people we're interviewing is they have a sense of grief almost for the experiences that they're not able to impart because they've been obliged to leave the newsroom, and they fear that corporate memory is no longer there. What do you think, Ross?
Oh, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there is a lot of had had to take redundancy. I should say that our redundancies are voluntary and they're very well paid, so people get quite generously bribed, in their case, to take the risk that says, if I give up my job and you give me money that allows me to halve my mortgage, am I confident that I'll be able to find another job? Now, that's just true of some of them. Most of them do find other jobs. I think probably it's true that most of them find jobs that they don't like as much as journalism.
And I can assure you that most of them find jobs that are paid substantially less.
Yes. Well, of course, that's part of it, and that was part of the move. You get me onto economics now, but part of the reason why we contracted out our sub-editing.
So well.
Oh,
not.
yeah. Well, yes.
I could have a very long conversation about what is going on with the New Zealand sub-editing of your text.
But that's for another
the madness.
time, Ramona.
Okay.
Drives me nuts.
But all the simple point I want to make, it's the kind of point that an economics editor would make, is that often it's you let these people go, and they go and work for the crowd that you've subcontracted to now do your subbing. The difference is that they get paid a lot less, and that's the saving.
But it doesn't save you a paper in the end, because
well,
the readership is going to kill you.
As I said to my editor at the time, and she was a smart woman who didn't need me to tell her, but I told her anyway, as is my custom. I said, listen, journalists think that quality is going out and getting scoops. Readers think that quality is no spelling or grammar mistakes.
As well as scoops. It's not that hard, though, is it?
Well,
I mean, it's not either or, surely.
It is when you're under cost pressure.
yes. That's been a cost-saving thing, and if you say, has the quality gone down? Of course it has. All I'd say is it could have gone down worse than it has. But the other part of it is the digital first, which says, you've just written this piece, we're going to bang it on the site within seconds. And that means it gets if it gets any subbing, it's the roughest you can imagine.
I don't need to imagine, I see it.
In the old days, you'd write it and there'd be a couple of hours for people to check it over before it was seen by the public. And since we're telling old stories, we had this reader who moved from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, which meant that he saw the first edition. And he said, I don't know what it is, but the paper's really gone off, and it's full of mistakes and all that. Well, that's because in the good old days, we used to get the first edition and fix all the mistakes. So if you lived in the country, you got the mistakes, but if you're in the city and you got the second edition, you got the cleaned up version.
Now, Jim, you've alluded to this idea that in one sense you feel ill-equipped, to deal with what's going on. Has there ever been a time in history where you've had generationally this disconnect between those who've got experience and those who've got new skills in an emerging generation? And how do you deal with it?
This it seems to me is the one genuinely qualitative change we've had in the nature of production and distribution of news. There have been challenges to the existing media outlets, the arrival of radio for newspapers, followed by the arrival of television for both newspapers and radio. But what we're seeing now, but they did not, they challenged but did not threaten the very existence of the other forms of media that were around. Radio didn't kill the newspapers. Television didn't kill either newspapers or radio, although they both went through some difficult periods as a consequence. But what you're having now is a situation where the very profitability, the ability to make money, and I exclude the ABC from this because it's publicly funded thanks to people like you, but what you're seeing now is that the very existence of newspapers, of television too, television news, not so much radio, I suspect, because radio in some ways is more like new media than either newspapers or television. But this is threatening the very business of journalism itself. It's not just that it's getting rid of, and probably will get rid of, newspapers and may well get rid of television news as such as well, but it's actually, I think, threatening journalism as a concept too, as a trade, which is, as we've known it, has been in existence really for a century.
Well, but it's not intrinsically the fault of the technology, because I'm a tech head from way back, and I adore technology, and I think used properly it's exciting and interesting, and we can do different kinds of journalism, all the data journalism we can do now. But we need to do the getting out on the beat and talking to people and hanging around and waiting for interesting stories to develop and all of that sort of stuff. It seems to me, and I'm not an economist, but the economics of journalism means that you're cheapening journalism using new technologies, using clickbait and using listicles all of that, which is about trying to find an economic base for the enterprise, which is influencing the kind of stories that you can tell.
No one's discovered the trick of providing substantive, in-depth journalism that will pay in the digital environment.
So far,
no one's done it yet. I mean, hopefully, I seriously hope that it does come.
Because you could have 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 word brilliant essays that maybe would have been published in the New Yorker 30 years ago about some small ballet school on the top story of a New Jersey tenement or something, and which I would read because it was brilliantly written, and I didn't know I was interested in it until I started to read it. And you can have those long form things on digitally because it doesn't cost you anything to print it. But there's lots of things you could do with the new journalism, new media, if only somebody would discover the pot of gold.
Look, even as a kid, long before I even thought about being a journalist, one of the great adventures of any day was when my father had finished reading the newspaper at breakfast, was to get hold of it before I went to school. And it was a voyage of discovery. I mean, it wasn't just simply... you could discover everyday things you did not know, not just about... I grew up in New Zealand, so it wasn't whether the All Blacks were going to win the next test or anything like that. There were things that you could run across completely by happenstance. And because the barriers to entry were so high and the profitability was so great, the media organisations could fund this stuff and have a broad landscape, a broad tapestry of stuff that they knew wasn't going to interest every single consumer. And the same goes for radio and television as well. Not quite in the same way, but if you had no choice but to listen to 8 radio stations in Melbourne, the choices were obviously limited, and therefore you could discover stuff in that way that you didn't know. You could discover things that you didn't know you wanted to know and go from there. And I think that's less of the case currently in the digital environment. You can do it at a superficial level a lot.
You might be undervaluing cat videos there, I think, Jim.
Sorry?
You might be undervaluing cat videos. Incredibly exciting things. Let me ask you this question. What do you wish you'd learnt along the way to better prepare you for the transition into new media? Are there any things that you should have picked up that would have better prepared you?
I would have liked to know how to type.
It doesn't apply to new media, but I'll tell you, I would have liked to have learned shorthand.
Yeah.
Yes, I would have liked to learn shorthand.
The funny thing was that when I started at the ABC, it was a condition of my cadetship that I did learn shorthand. Unfortunately, the ABC then, in its wisdom, decided 2 weeks after I'd started that it would be a good idea to send me to Canberra to report federal politics. And in those days, reporting federal politics meant reporting the Parliament. It meant the ABC had a person sitting in the press gallery from the moment the House of Representatives and the Senate started sitting till they closed, and we did this in one after the other in relay in 1 hour sessions. Now, they'd sent me to the very place where shorthand was almost essential, but they'd removed me from the environment in which I could learn it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know whether shorthand would have been of great benefit to me in a digital world. I doubt it, but I do regret that I never, ever learned that. It would have been a very, very handy tool.
I can tell you at Swinburne University we're having to make a very tough decision at the moment about whether or not we keep shorthand on the curriculum. It's a very tough decision to make.
Well,
What's
with
not to
Siri,
like
with Siri
about
and various
shorthand?
other things, do you need it? I mean, now you're getting verbatim text.
Yeah, but they're always inaccurate, aren't they?
Yes, but you can work your way through it.
Mm. What skills do you need now to operate? What skills do you wish you
All
had?
the skills that old people like me don't have. I mean, I can try and find things on Google and so on, but I know that somebody half my age can find infinitely more than I do in half the time. I mean, they just have they have a kind of native instinct of which button to press.
Do you feel a bit disenfranchised by that?
I do a bit, yeah, certainly.
I don't, because I can do it.
Yeah.
My only problem is that now I'm sort of working at home. I don't have an IT department, and I have to be my own IT department, and I have to sort of go hours and hours on the phone to Telstra or to Microsoft or to something. It's a lot of time is being wasted on this, but, you know, you have to do it.
Are you platform savvy, for want of a better term? Are you're on several different kinds
Twitter
of platforms?
and
Yeah.
Facebook.
Which ones?
And Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Is there? Well, nothing else, because I've got other things to do.
Snapchat, you on that?
No, I don't send pornographic things to other people.
If you read our metrics as carefully as I do, you would know that it's only Google and Facebook that matter. Even something like Twitter, which I'm on, and I can understand why people get caught up in Twitter. We don't get many referrals from Twitter. Our journos beaver away on Twitter, but the paper doesn't get much back.
Yeah, Twitter's a useful tool for a breaking story. If there's a leadership challenge and things are happening and people are either revealing that they're supporting Malcolm Turnbull or not supporting him, it's useful for that. If there's a terrorist attack in Ottawa, say, and developing, it's useful for that. But it's not, in my observation and my fairly primitive use of it, I've got to say, not useful for very much else.
Oh, I use it to see what people are reading and what people are saying I should read, and have a look at this.
I think that the referral part of it is good, but it doesn't seem, from our commercial point of view, it doesn't seem a big deal. Facebook is it.
Well, it's also a problem for organisations, mature organisations as well. I mean, for Sky, for example, it's a 24-hour news service behind a paywall, and until the ABC came along and set up a service that was available to everybody without a paywall, the ABC should be very, very thankful indeed for the amount of money the Rudd government doled out to people in the middle of the global financial crisis, because they all went out and bought digital TVs, and then as a consequence discovered that you could do more than get one ABC channel, one SBS and so on and so forth, and it happened to coincide exactly with the launch of ABC News 24, and a whole lot of people discovered there was this other channel which was great for the ABC but terrible for Sky. But in terms of monetising content, Sky gets a lot of stuff on, a lot of hits on Facebook, but it gets next to no money out of it. It's certainly not enough to fund a 24-hour news channel, and this is going to be a major challenge for it, and you can see the News Corporation as a whole wrestling with this.
Well, this has been
as a very severe problem.
This is being said by new media globally, that in fact Facebook takes, it doesn't give, and that it doesn't actually ever provide much in the way of revenue.
And I'm also very suspicious of their algorithms too, in terms of guiding people away and to. I'm sure that there will increasingly be commercial arrangements that Facebook has that it will favour people who are providing them with more money than others, and that will then have a bias in terms of what's available and what comes up first and what comes up fastest.
So have you all gone through a process of reinvention or not, to kind of keep pace with what's going on?
Reinvention's not the word I'd use, but learning new tricks is. Learning to how to do links and getting into the habit of saying, oh, that's obviously something that I could provide a link for. I've been using this thing, and the reader could go out and dig it up the way I went out and dug it up. But why don't I just put in this link, and all I have to, if they're really interested in looking at the document that I've been writing about, they can click on it, which is good. And it also saves you answering emails saying, where can I find this mysterious document you keep talking about?
I sort of reinvented. Well, I'd written books before I left the ABC, but in the last 4 years I've now written 2, and I'm about to start thinking about the next one. And so I've reinvented myself as a person who stays at home with the laptop and, you know, the gorgeousness of being associated with the Centre for Advancing Journalism and Melbourne University means that I've got a library card and I can actually access the world's everything through...
Is it a digital library card?
Yeah, absolutely, everything. And I also go and borrow books and get them through interlibrary loans and all of it. And it just feels like, you know, I'm at home and the world is there at my fingertips. So, you know, the reinvention is to make the best of this, you know, the writer at home in the garret, but connected to the world. And it's, you know, terribly exciting to do that.
Jim?
Yeah, the answer for me is not as much as I should have. And in part that's as a consequence of circumstances that I've shifted from being a reporter in Canberra, where I'd been for 20 years, into presenting a program which put me, strangely enough, at slight distance from the technological developments that were going on at the time. So at that moment was just as journalists were being started, we were started to be expected to edit our own visual content, and so in a sense I missed that shift, and now it almost seems too late to learn the skills that are required. The other thing that I would have liked to have done is become more immediately proficient at shooting my own stuff and sending it back. That is, the whole live technology that's now available would make me more useful than I currently am, and would make me feel more confident about what I'm doing.
Yeah, you wouldn't walk in the front door of any television or video organisation now without being able to do everything.
Yeah,
would you?
and that's a good thing. And I mean, it's
in fact, we're way past the industrial debates about that, aren't we? Because years ago it was about the demarcations between it.
Well, the idea that you would have,
well, yes, we got rid of the demarcations. What we've got now is work intensification.
But, you know, us at Radio National, we were used to going off everywhere with, you know, with our equipment and record. You know, I used to go to Edinburgh on my own steam and sit in front of 1,000 people at the Edinburgh Festival and sneak in before, set up the sound, you know, get my levels right, check the sound at the stage, go and get the person, be in front of the audience, hope that, you know, my levels were still okay and nobody moved anything and nobody twiddled a dial. At the end of it, go back, you know, send it off to the ABC or cut it and all of that. It was like, you know, it was a one-person thing.
Audio got there about 15 years before television,
Yeah.
and now that very much is the television model as well. And so you're saying it's almost too late now to teach yourself those skills?
Well, probably not. If I could sit back and simply, without having to do the other parts of the jobs that I do, and spend time, then I'm certain I could master it. But it's also, in a sense, what it is the shift from analogue to digital. I was saying to Ramona before in the green room, one of the aesthetic and physical pleasure in actually cutting a piece of 1/4-inch tape with a Chinograph pencil, a little editing block, and a razor blade to edit an interview together or an item for AM or PM is a pleasure that I enjoyed greatly and miss intensely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I could get exactly the same pleasure out of digital editing, both audio and visual.
But it was
as well.
moved exactly over. It was
Well, it
just
was.
exactly like that, except you did it digitally.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. The audio software is modelled entirely on the Chinograph pencil and 1/4-inch tape. That's the way it works. I'm wondering whether there are more opportunities for a sort of cross-pollination of ideas, you know, the model that the old give the wisdom to the young. Well, in fact, what we need more than perhaps ever before is the young giving their knowledge of so many different approaches.
I can assure you that the young people who sit near me give me plenty of, come over here and help me do this.
Yeah, young people are very used to helping old folk through the technology problems that we encounter.
And they should just ask questions while they're helping.
Yeah.
You know, because then it's
Yes.
what is that called? A something circle?
Virtuous.
Virtuous circle. That's right.
Is that
Because we
happening?
love telling people how to do stuff. And, you know...
You want to be like Kirsten Garrett was with you.
I would love to be like Kirsten Garrett was with me. I owe it to her to behave like that towards young people.
And that's something you miss sitting alone at home, I imagine.
Well, that's right. But, you know, I read up my children and tell them things. And
It is
they
one of the
say,
great,
"We
it is one of the
know,
great
we
pleasures
know."
of late career to see the number of people who started as young journalists working in the same office as you and whose advice the advice they sought from you and the assistance you gave them to see them flourish and flower as journalists and continue despite what I was talking about, the hollowing out of middle-ranking journalists, to see them move on and start doing the same thing to younger journalists and the younger cohort.
Well, in fact, that's one of the joys of being in journalism education, is seeing that happen. Yeah. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, there's a person there.
Hi. You've talked a lot about technology, but I was wondering about skills that journalists still need, like developing contacts, news sense, and finding stories, and how that changed as you became a more experienced journalist.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of that's the craft core skills of journalism that have not gone away.
No,
yeah,
they
don't always make that extra phone call. In fact, make a phone call. I'm intrigued by the number of young journalists that I see these days, and they're encouraged by PR people working for politicians and corporates who will attempt to only communicate with you via text. There's a lot more you can get out of a telephone call than you can get out of a text conversation. Let me tell you, there are things you discover simply by the tone of somebody's voice. You can discover, or it will give you a sense that you're not getting the whole truth or only part of it, or there's much more to this story than may meet the eye. And even better, go and talk to them. It's interesting that I'm told, I haven't been in Canberra since the change of leadership, but one of the things I've been told is that the door to the Prime Minister's press office is now permanently open rather than shut as it was in the Abbott years, and that, in other words, there's an invitation there, if you're wise enough to take it, to go in and talk to people, even if it is only the flax, but at least that is better than simply being told that something's going on by a text that arrives at 6:30 in the morning.
And be persistent and make another phone call and another phone call. And it's not rude to ring people early in the morning.
No.
If they are people who are in, you know, positions of influence, and that you need to get their views, and ring them at 6 and ring them at 5, and you just have to get a bit brazen and just go, I mean, this is not a tea party. You know, I'm not here at a dance.
The worst that can happen to you is that they hang up on you.
Exactly, and you just have to, and don't wait for people to get back to you. I mean, if they haven't got back to you yet and you want to know, you just keep ringing. I mean, these kinds of things, it's about sort of self-presentation and not being shy to be persistent.
I hope that young people coming into journalism still learn that kind of thing, that, you know, you ring up some important person on a Sunday afternoon, you spend the first 30 seconds apologising profusely, and then you ask them half an hour's worth of questions.
And you can ask the same question many times if they haven't answered it. And it's not rude, it's your job.
And when you're having the conversation with the experienced journalist in the newsroom because you're helping them post something on Facebook or boot their computer, this is the kind of advice you'll get. It's the virtuous circle. Yeah. Gail, the question here? The question here, just to start with. We'll come to you in a sec, sir.
I'm a fellow at an honorary fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism, like Ramona, and it's just a small comment. You were talking about the relative merits of Twitter or Facebook as a source or a driver. And at the Centre, Meg and I have been doing research on, we've got an ARC linkage grant to take it further, but we were doing research on what actually drives news agendas in major newsrooms in Australia. It was related to violence against women, research that we were doing related to the media. Anyway, what was interesting in it was that we did the Herald Sun, the project on Channel 10, which is a huge source of news and information, a huge number of people watching it, and a totally online publication, Mamma Mia, Women's Network. And whilst the Herald Sun was driven largely, almost exclusively by the old-fashioned ways, like, you know, what their reporters found, the press releases that came across their desk, leaders in the society and so on, actually both the project and Mamma Mia were driven mostly by Twitter. They were responding always to what was going on out there, what was the vibe, what was the beat.
Twitter is for journalists, and journalists get a lot of ideas and impetus from Twitter. What the people at the Herald say is we don't get many referrals from Twitter. But Twitter is a different thing. Twitter is a kind of, I think Twitter is more intellectual, but it has its limitations. And the other thing I think about all this social media is that everyone might be on Facebook, but your set of friends might be in a completely different world to somebody else's set of friends. And I think Twitter's like that too. And it can be an echo chamber. But as Jim says, if there's something going down in Parliament House, you can follow it far more closely through Twitter than you could ever have done in any other way, even by being in the building.
Sue.
I was interested in the section of the conversation just at the start of the session when you were talking about experience teaching that you keep yourself out of the story. And we certainly had that mantra dinned into us from day one. It's not about you. And my recollection is that in the newspapers, the distinction between what was news and what was comment and opinion with photo bylines was really quite clear. But I now find that it's very hard to get my students to understand that concept because so much now it actually is about them. They're all on social media, they've all got blogs, they're all posting their opinions about every little thing. They produce news stories when you say, look, you don't put your own opinion in a news story, where people have. I just was interested to know whether you think, though, that kind of distinction really is breaking down in the digital world.
Who's interested in what they're writing, though?
Well, that's a whole other issue,
who's
isn't it?
reading their blogs about them? And, I mean, I don't know how many people would be interested. That's not really journalism.
The same people that are posting back selfies after they post a selfie.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not to discount, though, you know, the idea of, you know, the old new journalism where the investigator, where the reporter, you know, people like Norman Mailer or, you know, were part of the story, but they didn't it wasn't really all about them. They were there as your guide through the story. Yeah. And they told you about themselves and they critiqued themselves too, and they gave you a sense of who they were and how the people they met were responding to them perhaps, of their sort of pugilistic nature or something. But so they were like your emissaries through the story, and I think that can be very interesting.
Yes.
But that's not about being self-conscious. That's about, you know, that's actually about pulling back on the ego, because you're not sort of saying how marvellous you are. It's not all about you. It's saying, I am your conduit through this story, and I will take you, I will be your Virgil through this story.
I will tell you what I saw.
Yeah.
I agree with all that. It applies particularly to reporting. It applies to, as we were saying earlier, it applies to the interview, where you don't, you don't have an Alan Jones thing where the questions are longer than the answers. But I'm actually in the column writing business, and let me tell you that if you keep yourself and your opinions out of a column, you can do that. You can refer to yourself, as some of my competitors do, as this space, but I talk about myself and my thoughts, and I have a conversation with the reader in a way that you would have a conversation with someone. And I think that actually for a columnist, putting some of yourself in it makes it hugely more attractive. And when people get the feeling that they know you, they've never actually met you in the flesh, but they've read you talking about your kids or whatever, then suddenly you get a very enthusiastic bunch of followers out there. And I've done it myself, and I've seen plenty of other journalists do it, and I've seen yet more journalists who think, oh no, you must never ever use the first person.
Look, analysis and context are important. A bunch of facts on their own don't necessarily tell you all that there is to know about it. I remember many, many years ago writing about a leadership challenge it was when Sir Eric Willis was challenged by Peter Coleman, or Eric Willis had left. I can't remember exactly, but there was a hiatus.
It was Willis and Lewis, wasn't it? They were the two.
There was a 2-week gap.
Premiers
effectively between when the resignation occurred and the vote was going to be taken. And I wrote a story in which I said something about that insiders were tipping that Peter Coleman would be the next leader. I got a memo the next day from the head of ABC Radio News saying, "We are not in the tipping business. We will leave that to Randwick and so on and so forth." Now, I took the point at the time, but it would be unthinkable in the period when I was in Canberra between 1988 and 2007, where I had not reported what was being said by those who were gathering the numbers for whoever was the bunch of leadership contenders at the time. It's a dynamic story. You can't just stop reporting because there's no...
And this raises a very important question, I think, about gallery reporting, and that is this line that says, "I know it, but I can't say it." And there is an enormous amount of things that happen in Canberra that everybody in the gallery knows about, but they all have this belief that it shouldn't be said, and so they don't say it.
Let's go to the next question. There's a question over here.
You talked a little bit about training and education and mentoring. This question is mostly for Ross. You've just gotten rid of Colin McKinnon, who was the training and education person at The Age, and his equivalent in Sydney, to be replaced by an HR person. How do you expect to train up the next generation of quality journalists without that?
With difficulty.
Yes, that's a good question. Because as I was alluding to earlier, our formula for saving money has not been about saying we won't get any new trainees. It's about saying we'll get lots of trainees and we'll train them up, and they'll all be cheaper than the people that we let go. So I'm not sure how all that works. And I'm not sure why that's been done, and I'm not sure that it's a good idea, but it's still on my list of asking the boss what the hell's going on.
We have time for one more question.
As far as, like, obviously there's the ABC internships and things like that, if you're unsuccessful gaining an internship or something like that, what are some other alleyways you can go down? Like, can you just go up and ask somebody, can I just sit in the room for 10 minutes and talk to you guys? Or, like, what other alleyways and what other avenues are there for young people trying to get into the industry?
I think volunteering is a really good idea. Go to RRR or 3CR or a local paper, or interning, I suppose it's called now. Just do it. Just do it. Just write what you want to write. Go and interview people. Say, I've got this or I've got that. Make it into something. Show people what you're doing. I mean, I just think you can't just wait for the world to tap you on the shoulder. You just have to do it because it's fun, and
you've
it'll
got to
teach
act like
you
a journalist even though you aren't one, and then show it to them.
And you can ask people.
It's kind of what, like Ramona did with, what's her name?
With Kirsten Garrett.
Yeah. Nobody asked her for it. She sent it along, and it worked.
We had a session on this yesterday, and the resounding message from that session was just that. The best way to get a job is often not to walk through the front door. Those doors generally are closed now. The best way to do it is to go out and do journalism, break some stories, and then the work begins to find you.
Because, Andrew, one of the good qualities for journalists is chutzpah.
Yeah.
And I've never had enough of it, to be quite honest. But if you put yourself forward in that sort of way, even though you're not getting any monetary benefit for it, you're actually demonstrating one of the quintessential skills of being a good journalist.
And I think that's probably a good point at which to wrap this up, and another indication of the kind of the tip that comes from experience. So please join me in thanking Jim, Ross and Ramona.
And Andrew.
Thank you.